3 years ago, on a crisp October morning that should have marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life, Sarah Thompson vanished without a trace after purchasing the old Millbrook house on Cedar Ridge Road, a property that had stood empty and avoided by locals for over 15 years. The 29-year-old graphic designer, known for her meticulous attention to detail and methodical approach to life decisions, had driven from Philadelphia with dreams of starting fresh in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, seeking solace and creative inspiration in a place far removed from the traumatic memories that haunted her city life. But within days of moving into what she believed would be her sanctuary, she disappeared completely and mysteriously, leaving behind only her carefully packed boxes, detailed renovation plans, and a community plunged into fear, confusion, and the kind of creeping paranoia that transforms neighbors into suspects and peaceful towns into pressure cookers of suspicion and doubt. Before we continue, subscribe, like this video, and hit the bell icon. This helps the channel bring more stories like this one and ensures that cases like Sarah's receive the attention they deserve. The police investigation, led by a small-town department more accustomed to handling domestic disputes and minor property crimes than complex missing person cases, considered various possibilities with the kind of methodical thoroughness that looks impressive on paper, but fails to capture the urgency and desperation felt by those who loved Sarah. They explored voluntary departure, despite Sarah's documented excitement about the house purchase and her detailed plans for renovation. They investigated potential foul play, though no evidence of violence or struggle could be found anywhere on the property. They even considered the possibility of an accident, conducting searches of the surrounding wilderness that yielded nothing but frustration and false hope. Their failure to solve the case quickly caused mounting outrage among Sarah's family members, who never lost hope, despite the passing months and years, and who continue to fight tirelessly for the truth to emerge, often at great personal cost, and with little support from a system that seems designed to forget rather than remember. Sarah's decision to purchase the Millbrook house surprised everyone who knew her, from her close-knit family in Pittsburgh to her colleagues in Philadelphia's competitive graphic design industry. The Victorian-era property, with its elaborate gingerbread trim and imposing three-story structure, had stood empty for over 15 years, its reputation in the small town of Cedar Ridge oscillating between local curiosity for architecture enthusiasts and whispered warnings passed down through generations of residents who had learned to avoid the property entirely. Real estate agent Janet Morrison, a veteran of 30 years in the local market, who had seen the house defeat multiple potential buyers, later recalled Sarah's unusual determination during their first meeting, describing a young woman who seemed not just drawn to the house's isolated charm despite its obvious need for extensive repairs, but almost compelled by something she couldn't quite articulate. The transaction itself proceeded with unusual speed that surprised even Morrison, who had become accustomed to lengthy negotiations and multiple inspection periods that typically accompanied the sale of such a complex property. Sarah paid the full asking price in cash, money she had painstakingly saved from selling her Philadelphia apartment and settling her late grandmother's estate, funds that represented years of careful financial planning and sacrifice. Her family, particularly her protective older sister Jennifer, questioned the impulsive nature of the decision, especially since they had expected Sarah to move closer to home after their grandmother's death 6 months earlier, not further away to a town where she knew absolutely no one and had no professional connections or support network. The move itself was as methodical as everything else Sarah did. On October 15th, she arrived at the property with a professional moving truck and exactly 3 boxes of carefully selected personal belongings, a minimalist approach that reflected her desire to start completely fresh, leaving behind not just her physical possessions, but the emotional baggage that had accumulated during her difficult final years in Philadelphia. Neighbor Harold Vickers, a retired widower who lived across the field and had appointed himself the unofficial guardian of the neighborhood's peace and quiet, observed her unloading items throughout the afternoon with the kind of careful attention that comes naturally to people with too much time and too few distractions. Harold's observations, which would later become crucial to the investigation, painted a picture of a woman who approached her new life with the same precision she brought to her design work. She was methodical and quiet, arranging boxes according to a system only she understood, waving politely when their eyes met across the distance, but showing no interest in the kind of neighborly conversation that Harold had been hoping might break the isolation of his own daily routine. The last confirmed sighting of Sarah occurred that evening around 9 p.m., when Harold noticed lights moving through the house's windows in what appeared to be a systematic pattern, as if she were conducting a thorough exploration of every room in her new home. What Harold didn't know, and what wouldn't be discovered until much later in the investigation, was that Sarah had been experiencing increasingly strange and unsettling sensations in the house from the very moment she stepped across its threshold. In her final phone call to Jennifer that night, a conversation that Jennifer would replay in her mind thousands of times over the following years, Sarah mentioned feeling watched by invisible eyes and hearing unexplained sounds from upstairs rooms that she hadn't yet explored. The sounds she described were rhythmic and deliberate, like footsteps or furniture being moved, but they stopped abruptly whenever she tried to investigate their source. Jennifer, who was dealing with her own grief over their grandmother's death and the stress of her demanding job as a social worker in Pittsburgh, assumed her sister was simply experiencing the normal anxiety that comes with moving into an old house alone. She offered what seemed like reasonable advice at the time: give the old house time to feel like home, and remember that old buildings naturally make unusual sounds as they settle. It was practical advice that Jennifer would later torment herself for giving, wondering if she had been more concerned and less dismissive, whether Sarah might have left the house that very night instead of staying to face whatever was waiting for her in the darkness. By October 18th, when Sarah failed to answer repeated calls, missed a scheduled video interview for a prestigious freelance project that could have launched her career in a new direction, and failed to respond to increasingly frantic messages from both family and professional contacts, Jennifer made the decision that would change her life forever. She called in sick to work, loaded her car with supplies, and made the 3-hour drive from Pittsburgh to Cedar Ridge, driven by a sister's intuition that something was terribly, irreversibly wrong. What Jennifer found when she arrived at the Millbrook house would haunt her dreams for years to come, and launch an investigation that would ultimately expose secrets that had been buried for over a century. Secrets that would shake the foundation of a small town's carefully constructed sense of safety and normalcy. Jennifer's hands trembled uncontrollably as she pushed open the heavy oak door of the Millbrook house, a door that Sarah had described over the phone as requiring significant restoration, but which now stood as an ominous threshold between the known world of rational explanation and something far more sinister and incomprehensible. The silence inside felt oppressive and alive, broken only by the creaking of old floorboards beneath her feet, sounds that seemed to echo not just through the empty rooms, but through time itself, carrying whispers of all the tragedy and mystery that had unfolded within these walls over more than a century of occupation and abandonment. The scene that greeted Jennifer appeared completely normal at first glance, which somehow made it infinitely more disturbing than any evidence of struggle or violence might have been. Sarah's belongings remained exactly where she had placed them 3 days earlier, with her characteristic precision and organization. Moving boxes neatly stacked in the living room according to a labeling system that Jennifer recognized from their childhood. Toiletries arranged on the bathroom counter in the same orderly pattern Sarah had maintained since college, and her laptop open on the kitchen table with the screensaver slowly rotating through a carefully curated collection of family photos that told the story of their lives together. Every detail suggested that Sarah had simply stepped outside for a moment and would return at any second. Yet the atmosphere in the house felt charged with an energy that made Jennifer's skin crawl and her instincts scream that something had gone terribly wrong. The normalcy of the scene felt like a carefully constructed lie, as if someone had deliberately arranged everything to suggest that Sarah had left voluntarily, when every fiber of Jennifer's being told her that her sister would never have abandoned her belongings, her dreams, or her family without explanation. But there was one detail that shattered the illusion of normalcy and sent chills down Jennifer's spine, a detail so bizarre and inexplicable that it would haunt investigators for years to come and challenge every rational explanation they could construct. Every single window in the house stood wide open, despite the October cold that had settled over Pennsylvania like a premature winter, bringing temperatures that would have been uncomfortable even for someone fully dressed, let alone someone trying to sleep in an unfurnished house without proper heating. Jennifer found this particularly disturbing because Sarah had always been extremely sensitive to cold temperatures, a quirk that dated back to a childhood illness that had left her with poor circulation. Sarah would never have left windows open overnight, let alone for multiple days during cold weather, and she certainly wouldn't have opened every window in the house simultaneously. The open windows created a cross breeze that filled the house with the sound of wind moving through empty rooms, a sound that could easily be mistaken for whispers or footsteps by someone already on edge. Jennifer immediately called the Cedar Ridge Police Department, her voice shaking as she tried to explain the situation to a dispatcher who seemed more concerned with following proper procedures than understanding the urgency of the situation. Officer Michael Torres, a young patrolman new to the force and eager to prove himself capable of handling serious cases, arrived within 20 minutes of the call, followed shortly by Detective Patricia Wells, a 15-year veteran of the department who would eventually become not just the primary investigator on the case, but also Jennifer's closest ally in the fight for answers. Detective Wells approached the scene with the methodical thoroughness that had earned her a reputation as one of the most competent investigators in the county, despite working for a department that lacked the resources and experience to handle complex cases. She methodically documented every detail of the scene, while Officer Torres canvassed the immediate area for any signs of struggle, forced entry, or evidence that might explain Sarah's disappearance. Their investigation was hampered by the contamination that had already occurred. Jennifer had naturally touched surfaces and moved through the house before calling police, and the open windows had allowed weather and wildlife to potentially disturb evidence. The initial investigation revealed a confusing absence of evidence that pointed toward any particular theory about Sarah's fate. There were no signs of violence or struggle anywhere on the property, no disturbed earth that might suggest burial sites, no blood or other biological evidence that might indicate harm had come to Sarah within the house itself. Sarah's purse remained on the kitchen counter, exactly where she might have placed it after arriving home, containing $340 in cash, all her credit cards with no suspicious activity, and her identification documents that would have been essential for any planned departure from the area. Her cell phone lay beside the laptop, fully charged, and showing no recent calls or messages after her conversation with Jennifer on October 15th, a digital silence that was completely uncharacteristic for someone who typically maintained constant contact with family and friends through social media and text messaging. Most puzzling of all was the absence of Sarah's car keys, though her Honda Civic sat locked in the driveway with no signs of tampering or attempted theft, its interior as pristine and organized as Sarah had left it. Detective Wells conducted her first interview with Harold Vickers, who proved to be an observant and reliable witness despite his advanced age and the traumatic nature of the situation. Harold provided the last confirmed sighting of Sarah, but his testimony also introduced elements that would prove crucial to understanding the timeline of her disappearance. Harold mentioned seeing lights in the house on October 15th, moving in patterns that suggested someone was systematically exploring each room, but he also noticed something unusual and deeply unsettling the following morning. When Harold looked toward the Millbrook house around 6 a.m. during his routine dog walk, a schedule he had maintained religiously for over a decade since his wife's death, he observed what appeared to be a human silhouette, standing motionless in the upstairs bedroom window that faced his property. The figure was positioned in a way that suggested it was looking directly toward his house, maintaining a vigil that lasted for the several minutes it took Harold to complete his dog's morning routine. Harold initially assumed it was Sarah, though even at the time he found it odd that she would stand so perfectly still for such an extended period, especially at such an early hour when most people would still be sleeping. When he looked again after cleaning up after his dog and completing his usual morning tasks, the figure had vanished, without any sign of movement or transition, as if it had simply dissolved into the morning air. The witness initially thought little of this observation, attributing it to the natural behavior of someone settling into a new home and possibly dealing with insomnia or excitement about the move. However, when Detective Wells pressed him for more detailed descriptions during their interview, Harold admitted that something about the silhouette had struck him as fundamentally wrong, though he struggled to articulate exactly what had bothered him about what he had seen. The figure had seemed too tall for Sarah, whose petite stature Harold remembered clearly from their brief interaction when she had signed for a package delivery. The posture had been unnaturally rigid, lacking the subtle movements and shifts in position that characterize living humans, even when they're trying to remain still. Most disturbing of all, the figure's head had been tilted at an angle that suggested either injury or an unnatural positioning that no comfortable person would maintain for any length of time. Detective Wells documented Harold's statement with the thoroughness that would characterize her entire investigation, but she initially attributed his unsettling observations to the suggestive power of hindsight and the natural human tendency to find sinister meaning in ordinary events when viewed through the lens of tragedy. However, this testimony would gain significance as more witnesses came forward with remarkably similar accounts, painting a picture that challenged conventional explanations and thrust the small community into a mystery that would consume their thoughts and conversations for years to come. The detective's initial report noted several inconsistencies that would plague the investigation from its very beginning. The timeline of Sarah's disappearance didn't match the witness sightings. The physical evidence suggested both voluntary departure and potential foul play, and the house itself seemed to be as much a character in the mystery as any of the human participants. These inconsistencies would eventually lead Detective Wells to question not just what had happened to Sarah Thompson, but also what dark secrets the Millbrook house had been keeping for over a century. In the days and weeks following Sarah's disappearance, as news of the missing young woman spread through Cedar Ridge's tightly knit community, like wildfire through dry brush, Detective Wells expanded her investigation far beyond Harold Vickers' disturbing testimony, methodically canvassing every residence within a 2-mile radius of the Millbrook house. What she uncovered was a pattern of increasingly disturbing sightings that had begun shortly after Sarah moved into the property. Sightings that created a timeline of events so bizarre and contradictory that it challenged everything the detective thought she knew about conducting rational investigations based on physical evidence and logical deduction. The pattern that emerged from these interviews was more complex and frightening than anything Detective Wells had encountered in her 15 years of police work, involving multiple credible witnesses who had observed unexplained activity at the Millbrook property during times when Sarah should have already been missing, according to the official timeline. These weren't the unreliable accounts of attention seekers or the confused recollections of elderly witnesses struggling with memory issues. These were detailed, consistent reports from respected community members whose integrity had never been questioned and whose powers of observation had been proven reliable in previous situations. Margaret Chen, a retired school principal who lived 2 houses down on Cedar Ridge Road and was known throughout the community for her sharp mind and precise memory, provided testimony that fundamentally challenged the investigation's basic assumptions about when Sarah had actually disappeared. Margaret reported seeing lights moving through the Millbrook house on both October 16th and 17th, dates when Sarah should have already been missing for at least 24 to 48 hours, according to the timeline established by her final phone call with Jennifer. Margaret had initially dismissed these sightings as completely normal, assuming that Sarah was simply settling into her new home and working late into the evening on unpacking and organizing her belongings. It wasn't until Detective Wells revealed the official timeline of Sarah's disappearance that Margaret realized she had been witnessing something far more sinister and inexplicable than a new resident adjusting to her surroundings. The lights Margaret had observed weren't random or chaotic, but followed repetitive, almost ritualistic patterns that suggested deliberate intention rather than the casual movements of someone going about normal evening activities. Each night around 10 p.m., lights would begin moving through the house in the same precise sequence, starting in the ground floor living room, progressing methodically through the kitchen and dining room, then moving upstairs to systematically illuminate each bedroom before returning to the ground floor and repeating the entire cycle multiple times throughout the night. Margaret's detailed observations were corroborated by her meticulous habit of keeping a journal, where she had noted the unusual lighting patterns on both nights without initially understanding their significance. Her written records provided investigators with precise times and descriptions that would have been impossible to fabricate after the fact, lending credibility to testimony that might otherwise have been dismissed as the imagination of a witness influenced by the drama of the situation. Thomas Muller, a retired postal worker who had delivered mail to the rural Cedar Ridge route for over 25 years and prided himself on his intimate knowledge of every resident's habits and schedules, provided perhaps the most unsettling testimony of all. On October 17th, while placing mail in the Millbrook house's mailbox, a routine he had performed thousands of times at hundreds of different addresses, he observed a figure standing perfectly motionless in the ground floor window, positioned in such a way that it appeared to be watching his every movement with an intensity that made him deeply uncomfortable. The person in the window maintained an unblinking vigil as Thomas sorted through the mail, a process that typically took him 2 to 3 minutes at each stop. When he waved in the friendly manner that had become his trademark throughout the community, the figure didn't respond with even the slightest acknowledgement, behavior that Thomas found not just rude, but genuinely disturbing, given his reputation as one of the most beloved and respected members of the community. Thomas's testimony became even more significant when he revealed that he had made careful mental notes about the figure's appearance, comparing it to his memory of Sarah from their brief meeting 2 days earlier when she had signed for a package delivery. The person in the window had been significantly taller than Sarah, whose petite stature Thomas remembered clearly, and the facial features, though partially obscured by shadows and the old window glass, had seemed somehow wrong, too angular and sharp to belong to the soft-featured young woman he had met just days before. The investigation took an even more disturbing turn when local teenager Emma Rodriguez came forward with her account, initially reluctant to speak with police because she feared her story would be dismissed as the overactive imagination of a 17-year-old girl influenced by too many horror movies and urban legends. Emma had been walking home from her evening shift at Cedar Ridge's only diner on October 16th, following a route that took her directly past the Millbrook house around 11 p.m., well past the time when most of the town's residents had settled in for the night. Emma's testimony provided the most detailed and disturbing description of the mysterious figure that multiple witnesses had observed. She clearly saw someone standing in the upstairs bedroom window, the same window that Harold Vickers had mentioned in his initial statement, but the person's posture and positioning struck her as fundamentally unnatural and deeply wrong in ways that she struggled to articulate to the adult investigators who questioned her. The figure stood with arms hanging straight down at its sides, in a position that no comfortable person would maintain for any length of time, head tilted at an angle that suggested either severe injury or an unnatural positioning that defied normal human anatomy. Most disturbing of all, the person remained perfectly motionless for the entire time Emma was visible from the road below, a period of several minutes that would have been uncomfortable for anyone to maintain, regardless of their reason for standing at the window. Emma's account was particularly credible because she had no prior knowledge of the other witness statements and had come forward independently, providing details that corroborated the other reports without any possibility of collaboration or suggestion. Her description of the figure's unnatural positioning matched Harold's observations exactly, despite the fact that the two witnesses had observed the phenomenon from different angles and at different times. Detective Wells found herself struggling to reconcile these multiple sightings with the physical evidence found at the scene. If Sarah had disappeared on October 15th, as the timeline suggested, who were these multiple credible witnesses seeing in and around the house over the following days? The possibility of an intruder seemed highly unlikely given the lack of forced entry, the undisturbed state of Sarah's belongings, and the absence of any theft or vandalism that might explain someone's presence on the property. Yet, the alternative explanations were even more difficult to accept. The witnesses were too numerous, too credible, and too consistent in their descriptions to be dismissed as mass hysteria or shared delusion. Their accounts suggested that someone, or something, had been systematically moving through the Millbrook house for days after Sarah's disappearance, following patterns that seemed almost ritualistic in their precision and repetition. The detective made the decision to conduct a more thorough and comprehensive search of the property, expanding beyond the house itself to include every outbuilding, storage area, and hidden space that might explain the mysterious sightings that had terrified the community. She also began researching the house's history more extensively, suspecting that understanding the property's past might provide crucial insights into its present mysteries. What Detective Wells discovered in the house's basement during this expanded search would add another layer of complexity to an already perplexing case, forcing her to consider possibilities that challenged not just her experience as a rational investigator, but her fundamental understanding of what was possible in the quiet rural community she had sworn to protect and serve. As October turned to November, and the first snows began to fall over Cedar Ridge, the Millbrook house stood empty once again, its windows now boarded up by order of the police department. But the sightings didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent and more detailed, creating a growing sense of unease that settled over the community like a persistent fog that no amount of sunshine could dispel, transforming a missing person case into something that resembled a supernatural thriller more than a conventional police investigation. As the investigation into Sarah Thompson's disappearance stretched into its second month, with no concrete leads or credible theories to explain her fate, Detective Wells made the crucial decision to delve deeply into the dark and troubled history of the Millbrook house itself, suspecting that understanding the property's past might provide essential insights into its present mysteries. Her exhaustive research at the Cedar Ridge Historical Society, combined with interviews of elderly community members and examination of archived newspaper records, revealed a property that had been steeped in tragedy, unexplained deaths, and paranormal phenomena for over a century, a history so consistently disturbing that it suggested Sarah may have unknowingly walked into something far more dangerous and complex than a simple real estate transaction. The house's troubled legacy began with its original construction and the circumstances surrounding its very first tragedy. Built in 1892 by Jonathan Millbrook, a wealthy and ambitious lumber merchant who had accumulated significant wealth during Pennsylvania's industrial boom, the elaborate Victorian mansion was designed as a monument to his success and a worthy home for his beloved bride, Catherine, whom he had married in a lavish ceremony that was the social event of the year in Cedar Ridge. The house represented everything Jonathan had worked for, a symbol of prosperity, stability, and the American dream realized through hard work and determination. But the fairy tale marriage was destined to become a nightmare that would haunt the property for generations to come. Historical records show that Catherine died under mysterious and disturbing circumstances in 1897, just 5 years after the house's completion, found at the bottom of the main staircase with severe head injuries that could have resulted from either an accidental fall or deliberate harm inflicted by another person. The circumstances surrounding her death were never fully investigated, partly due to the limited forensic capabilities of the era and partly due to Jonathan's significant influence in the community, which may have prevented a thorough examination of the evidence. Contemporary newspaper accounts of Catherine's death, preserved in the Historical Society's archives, reveal inconsistencies and unanswered questions that troubled even the reporters of that era. Neighbors reported hearing arguments from the house in the weeks preceding Catherine's death, along with sounds of furniture being thrown and what one witness described as ungodly screaming that echoed through the night air. Yet Jonathan maintained that his wife's death was a tragic accident, claiming that Catherine had been sleepwalking, a condition she had never previously exhibited, and had fallen down the stairs in her confused state. Jonathan left Cedar Ridge shortly after Catherine's funeral, abandoning the house he had built with such love and ambition, and never returning to the community that had once celebrated his success. Local records show that he sold his lumber business for a fraction of its value and disappeared from Pennsylvania entirely, leaving behind only debts and the growing reputation that his beautiful mansion was cursed by the tragedy that had occurred within its walls. Between 1900 and 1950, the Millbrook property changed hands 7 times, an unusually high turnover rate for such an expensive and architecturally significant home, especially in a small community where families typically maintained properties for generations. Detective Wells discovered a consistent pattern of brief occupancies followed by abrupt departures, with families abandoning not only the house, but often their belongings and even their businesses in Cedar Ridge, as if something about living in the mansion had convinced them that they needed to flee not just the property, but the entire area. The Mason family's experience in 1923 proved particularly illuminating and disturbing. Robert and Helen Mason purchased the house with plans to restore it to its original grandeur and established themselves as prominent members of Cedar Ridge society. They had significant financial resources, 3 young children, and every intention of making the Millbrook house their permanent family home for generations to come. But after living in the house for only 8 months, the Masons departed in the middle of the night, leaving behind furniture, clothing, family heirlooms, and even their children's toys. County records show they never returned to collect their possessions, which were eventually auctioned off by the county, to pay outstanding taxes on the property. Neighbors reported that Helen Mason had become increasingly nervous and paranoid during their final weeks in the house, claiming that she felt constantly watched and that objects in the house moved on their own during the night. The most disturbing and well-documented period in the house's history occurred in 1962, when the Hendricks family purchased the property with dreams of turning it into a bed and breakfast that would attract tourists interested in Victorian architecture and Pennsylvania's industrial history. Robert and Linda Hendricks moved in with their two young children, ages 8 and 10, and initially seemed to be thriving in their new environment, with Linda writing enthusiastic letters to relatives about their plans for restoration and their excitement about their new business venture. 4 months after moving in, Linda Hendricks was found dead in the master bedroom, under circumstances that raised questions that were never satisfactorily answered by the limited investigation conducted by the county sheriff's department. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, which seemed plausible, given that Linda had a family history of heart problems, but neighbors reported hearing terrifying screaming from the house on multiple occasions in the weeks preceding her death, screaming that stopped abruptly and was never explained or investigated. Detective Wells conducted an extensive interview with Eleanor Vasquez, now 89 years old, and one of the few surviving residents who had known Linda Hendricks personally during that tragic period in 1962. Eleanor's memories were sharp and detailed, providing insights into Linda's final weeks that had never been included in any official reports or newspaper accounts of her death. Eleanor revealed that Linda had confided her growing fears about the house during their regular coffee meetings in town, sharing experiences that had been dismissed at the time as stress-related delusions, but which now seemed remarkably similar to Sarah Thompson's final communications with her sister. Linda had told Eleanor that she felt constantly watched while living in the house, particularly in the master bedroom, where she would later be found dead. The sensation was so strong and persistent that Linda had begun sleeping in the guest room, claiming that the master bedroom felt occupied by an invisible presence that made her skin crawl and her heart race with unexplained anxiety. She had also mentioned repeatedly seeing a tall figure standing in doorways throughout the house, always just at the edge of her peripheral vision, vanishing whenever she turned to look directly at the supposed intruder. Most disturbing was Eleanor's account of Linda's final weeks, when her friend had become increasingly paranoid and desperate, insisting that someone was entering the house at night and systematically rearranging her belongings. Linda would wake up to find her clothes moved in her dresser, kitchen items relocated to different cabinets, and furniture shifted slightly from its previous positions. She would discover strange indentations on the bed beside where she slept, as if someone had been lying there during the night, and would sometimes find muddy footprints in the house, despite the fact that no one in the family had been outside during the night. Robert Hendricks had initially dismissed these concerns as manifestations of his wife's stress over the renovation project and the challenges of adjusting to life in a small rural community after years of living in suburban Philadelphia. He attributed her complaints to overwork, anxiety, and possibly early symptoms of a nervous breakdown brought on by the isolation and responsibility of their ambitious business plans. But Robert's skepticism was shattered on the morning he found Linda dead. According to Eleanor's account, which was based on Robert's own traumatized recollections shared with her in the days following the tragedy, Linda had been discovered in the master bedroom despite the fact that she had been sleeping in the guest room for weeks. Her body was positioned in a way that suggested she had been standing when she collapsed, and her face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror that haunted Robert for the rest of his life. The Hendricks family fled Cedar Ridge within days of Linda's funeral, abandoning not only the house, but also their business dreams and most of their possessions. Robert never spoke publicly about what had happened in the house, but Eleanor recalled that he had confided to her that he had experienced some of the same phenomena Linda had described: the sensation of being watched, objects moving during the night, and the persistent feeling that the house was occupied by something that resented their presence and wanted them gone. From 1962 until 1987, the Millbrook house remained completely empty, slowly deteriorating as the elements and time took their toll on its once magnificent architecture. The property became a source of local folklore and teenage dares, with stories growing more elaborate and frightening with each generation of storytellers who passed down accounts of the tragedies that had occurred within its walls. In 1987, a development company from Pittsburgh purchased the house with ambitious plans for renovation and resale as a luxury property that would attract wealthy buyers seeking a historic home with character and architectural significance. The renovation project began with enthusiasm and significant financial investment, but it was never completed despite months of work and thousands of dollars in improvements. The construction crew's experiences proved remarkably similar to the accounts provided by previous residents. Workers reported tools disappearing overnight and being found in impossible locations the following morning, unexplained sounds that seemed to emanate from within the walls themselves, and the persistent sensation of being watched while working alone in certain rooms, particularly the master bedroom where Linda Hendricks had died. The final straw came when 3 experienced construction workers quit in a single week, all claiming that the house was unsafe for reasons that had nothing to do with structural integrity or construction hazards. These were experienced professionals who had worked on historic renovations throughout Pennsylvania, but something about the Millbrook house had convinced them that no amount of money was worth continuing the project. The development company abandoned the renovation in 1988, selling the property at a significant loss to the county government, which had no plans for the building but needed to resolve the tax and legal issues surrounding the abandoned project. From 1987 until Sarah's purchase in 2021, the Millbrook house stood vacant, slowly deteriorating while the town of Cedar Ridge developed its own rich folklore around the property and the tragedies that had occurred within its walls. Detective Wells realized that Sarah Thompson had purchased far more than just a house when she bought the Millbrook property. She had acquired decades of unresolved mysteries, unexplained phenomena, and a history of tragedy that stretched back over a century. The pattern of brief occupancies, sudden departures, and unexplained deaths suggested that the house itself might somehow be connected to the disappearances and tragedies that had befallen its residents, though the detectives struggled to understand how a building could pose a threat to its occupants. The historical research provided crucial context for understanding not only Sarah's disappearance, but also the witness sightings that had puzzled investigators from the beginning of the case. If the house had a history of making its occupants feel watched and threatened, it was possible that Sarah had experienced the same phenomena that had driven away previous residents. But unlike those who had fled, Sarah had disappeared entirely, suggesting that whatever force operated within the Millbrook house had claimed its most permanent victim. As the harsh Pennsylvania winter settled over Cedar Ridge like a suffocating blanket, transforming the landscape into a stark and unforgiving environment that seemed to mirror the growing despair surrounding Sarah Thompson's disappearance, Detective Wells coordinated the most comprehensive and expensive search effort in the small town's history. The investigation expanded far beyond the Millbrook house itself to encompass the surrounding 200 acres of densely wooded property, numerous abandoned outbuildings dating back to the area's agricultural past, and the extensive network of old mine shafts that dotted the landscape like scars from the region's industrial heritage, remnants of Pennsylvania's coal mining boom that had ended decades earlier but left behind a dangerous underground maze that could easily conceal evidence or even human remains. The search effort involved resources that stretched the Cedar Ridge Police Department's limited budget to its breaking point, requiring assistance from state police, volunteer search and rescue teams from neighboring counties, and specialized equipment operators who donated their time and expertise to help find answers in a case that had captured the attention of the entire region. The scope and intensity of the search reflected not only the mysterious nature of Sarah's disappearance, but also the growing pressure from her family, local media attention, and a community that desperately needed answers to restore their sense of safety and normalcy. Search teams employed ground-penetrating radar to examine suspicious areas around the house's foundation and basement, using technology that could detect underground anomalies, disturbed soil, or buried objects that might provide clues about Sarah's fate. The radar operators, experienced professionals who had worked on numerous criminal investigations throughout Pennsylvania, found several areas of interest that required further investigation, including sections of the basement floor that showed unusual density patterns and areas around the house's foundation that appeared to have been disturbed more recently than the building's construction would suggest. Cadaver dogs were brought in from the state police, highly trained animals with proven track records in locating human remains, even after significant time had passed, or when bodies had been concealed or buried. The dogs methodically covered every room in the house, every crawl space and storage area, every corner of the basement and attic, and extensive areas of the surrounding property. Their handlers, experienced professionals who understood the subtle signals and behaviors that indicated the presence of human remains, watched carefully for any sign that the dogs had detected something significant. The basement search, conducted with particular thoroughness due to the underground location's potential for concealing evidence, revealed a disturbing discovery that added another layer of mystery to an already perplexing case. Investigators found what appeared to be fresh scratches in the stone walls, marks that were clearly recent, despite the house's long vacancy, suggesting that someone had been scraping at the walls with considerable force and determination. The scratches formed no discernible pattern or message, but their presence indicated that someone had spent significant time in the basement, possibly trying to dig or break through the stone foundation for reasons that could only be speculated upon. The marks were deep enough to suggest they had been made with metal tools rather than fingernails or improvised implements, indicating deliberate and sustained effort rather than random vandalism or the desperate scraping of someone trying to escape confinement. Forensic analysis of the stone dust and debris found at the base of the walls confirmed that the scratches were indeed recent, probably made within the past 6 months, which placed their creation during the period when the house was supposedly vacant. Forensic examination of Sarah's belongings, conducted with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that characterized Detective Wells's entire approach to the investigation, provided few definitive answers, but raised additional questions that complicated the timeline and circumstances of her disappearance. Sarah's laptop, which had been left open and running when Jennifer discovered the scene, contained a wealth of information about her final days and weeks, including browser history, email communications, and digital documents that revealed the depth of her interest in the Millbrook house's troubled history. The laptop's browser history showed that Sarah had been conducting extensive research into the property's past, spending hours reading archived newspaper articles, examining property records, and exploring genealogy websites that might provide insights into the families who had lived and died in the house over the decades. Her searches had focused particularly on the unexplained deaths of Catherine Millbrook and Linda Hendricks, suggesting that Sarah had been aware of the house's reputation and had been actively investigating its history rather than simply ignoring local folklore and superstitions. Most significantly, Sarah's research had led her to contact 3 different paranormal investigation groups, professional organizations that specialized in investigating reports of supernatural activity and unexplained phenomena. While none of these groups had responded to her initial inquiries before her disappearance, their existence in her email contacts suggested that Sarah had been taking seriously the possibility that the house might be haunted or affected by supernatural forces that could explain its troubled history. The search of the heavily wooded property surrounding the house proved both challenging and ultimately frustrating for investigators who had hoped that the rural setting might preserve evidence that would be destroyed in a more urban environment. The dense forest, which covered most of the 200-acre property, provided countless locations where someone could disappear or where evidence could be concealed, but November rains had washed away potential clues, and the thick undergrowth made systematic searching extremely difficult and time-consuming. Search teams discovered several old mine shafts scattered throughout the property, most of which had been sealed decades earlier, when the mining operations ended and the land was converted to private ownership. However, 2 of the shafts remained accessible, their openings partially concealed by vegetation, but still large enough for a person to enter, either voluntarily or involuntarily. Both shafts were thoroughly explored using specialized equipment and experienced spelunkers, revealing nothing but rusted mining equipment, stagnant groundwater, and the kind of underground environment that would quickly prove fatal to anyone who became trapped or injured below ground. The mineshaft exploration was particularly dangerous and expensive, requiring specialized rescue equipment and personnel trained in underground search and recovery operations. The shafts extended for hundreds of feet underground, with multiple branches and chambers that had been excavated during the area's mining heyday, but had been abandoned when the coal seams were exhausted or became economically unviable to extract. Detective Wells received an unexpected breakthrough when Jennifer Thompson, who had been cooperating fully with the investigation despite her own grief and trauma, provided investigators with access to Sarah's email account using passwords and security information that the sisters had shared in case of emergencies. Among the emails was correspondence that proved crucial to understanding Sarah's state of mind and activities during her final days in Cedar Ridge. Sarah had been in communication with Dr. Amanda Foster, a psychology professor at Pennsylvania State University, who specialized in environmental psychology and the effects of isolated living spaces on mental health and behavior. Sarah had contacted Dr. Foster just 3 days before her disappearance, describing in detail the feelings of being watched and the unexplained sounds she had experienced since moving into the Millbrook house. Dr. Foster's response, which had been sent on October 16th, after Sarah had already disappeared according to the established timeline, provided crucial insights into Sarah's psychological state and her approach to dealing with the disturbing experiences she had been having. The professor had recommended that Sarah document her experiences in detail, both to help her process whatever anxiety the situation was creating and to provide a record that might help explain whether the phenomena she was experiencing were psychological responses to isolation or genuine environmental factors that could be objectively measured and analyzed. The professor had also suggested that Sarah might be unconsciously responding to subtle environmental cues that previous occupants had left behind in the house: wear patterns in the floors, lingering scents that could trigger subconscious memories, acoustic properties that could create sounds resembling human activity, or even electromagnetic fields that some people were sensitive to and that could create feelings of unease or the sensation of being watched. If this case has already gripped you, leave a like. It helps the channel bring more stories like this one and helps Sarah Thompson's story reach more people who might have information that could solve this mystery. The investigation expanded to include comprehensive interviews with Sarah's former neighbors in Philadelphia, co-workers from her freelance graphic design business, and anyone else who had significant contact with her during the months leading up to her move to Cedar Ridge. These conversations painted a consistent picture of a methodical, rational woman who had been seeking solitude and creative inspiration rather than running from problems or exhibiting any signs of mental instability that might explain a voluntary disappearance. Sarah's Philadelphia landlord described her as an ideal tenant who had given proper notice, paid all her bills, and left her apartment in perfect condition, taking only personal belongings and leaving behind furniture and household items that she had planned to replace once she was settled in her new home. Her professional contacts confirmed that she had been actively seeking new clients and had been excited about the creative opportunities that her move to a rural setting might provide. As December snow began covering Cedar Ridge in a pristine white blanket that seemed to mock the dark mysteries hidden beneath its surface, the official search was reluctantly scaled back due to budget constraints and the lack of promising leads. However, Detective Wells continued her investigation on her own time, working nights and weekends without additional compensation, driven by a professional commitment and personal connection to the case that went beyond her official duties. The detective had become convinced that the answer to Sarah's disappearance lay somewhere in the complex intersection of the Millbrook house's troubled history, the psychological effects of isolation and fear, and physical factors that hadn't yet been discovered or properly understood. Her investigation was about to take a dramatic turn that would challenge everything she thought she knew about the case and force her to confront possibilities that seemed more appropriate to horror fiction than professional police work. 6 months after Sarah Thompson's disappearance had transformed Cedar Ridge from a quiet rural community into the center of a mystery that attracted media attention from across Pennsylvania and beyond, the Millbrook house drew attention once again when Jennifer Thompson made a decision that shocked not only Detective Wells and the local community, but also her own family members who feared for her safety and sanity. Despite the unsolved mystery surrounding her sister's fate, the disturbing witness accounts that had emerged during the investigation, and the house's documented history of tragedy and unexplained phenomena, Jennifer announced her intention to spend an extended period at the property, hoping to uncover clues that the extensive official investigation had somehow missed. Jennifer's decision wasn't the impulsive act of a grief-stricken woman acting irrationally in her desperation for answers, though many observers initially assumed that grief had clouded her judgment and driven her to make a choice that seemed both dangerous and unlikely to produce useful results. Instead, her plan was carefully thought out and methodically prepared, reflecting the same systematic approach that had characterized her successful career as a social worker and her lifelong reputation for making difficult but logical decisions in challenging circumstances. Jennifer had been haunted for months, not just by her sister's disappearance, but by increasingly vivid and detailed dreams about Sarah that seemed too realistic and specific to be dismissed as simple manifestations of grief and anxiety. These dreams consistently featured Sarah calling for help from somewhere within the Millbrook house, trapped in a location that Jennifer couldn't identify, but that felt familiar and accessible, as if the answer to finding her sister was hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by someone who knew what to look for and had the courage to search where others had failed to look. Against Detective Wells's advice, Jennifer arranged to stay at the property for a week in April 2022, 6 months after the disappearance. She installed motion-activated cameras throughout the house and carried recording equipment to document any unusual occurrences that might provide clues about Sarah's fate. The first 3 days passed without significant incident. Jennifer methodically searched areas that hadn't been thoroughly examined during the official investigation, focusing on loose floorboards, hidden compartments, and spaces behind the house's elaborate Victorian millwork. While she found nothing directly related to Sarah's disappearance, she discovered something unexpected: carved initials and dates hidden behind a loose baseboard in the master bedroom, documenting occupants from different eras who had felt compelled to leave their mark, as if marking their survival of whatever haunted the house. On the 4th night, Jennifer experienced what she would later describe as the most terrifying hours of her life. Around 2 a.m., she was awakened by the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside her bedroom door. The motion-activated cameras showed no movement, yet Jennifer clearly heard someone walking back and forth for over an hour. When she finally found the courage to investigate, the hallway was empty, but several doors she had closed were now standing wide open. The following morning brought a discovery that would redirect the entire investigation. While reviewing footage from her cameras, Jennifer noticed something the motion sensors had missed. In the early morning hours, the camera positioned in the living room had captured what appeared to be a tall figure standing motionless near the staircase. The image was unclear due to low light conditions, but the silhouette matched descriptions provided by previous witnesses with chilling accuracy. More disturbing was Jennifer's account of her final night at the house. She reported feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched from the moment darkness fell. Around midnight, she heard scratching sounds coming from within the walls, the same type of sound that might have created the marks discovered in the basement. The scratching seemed to move through the house, following a path from the basement up through the walls to the 2nd floor, as if something was trying to claw its way out from inside the structure itself. Jennifer cut her stay short, leaving on the 5th day instead of completing the planned week. As she packed her belongings in the dim morning light, she made one final discovery that would reignite the official investigation: a small piece of fabric caught on a splinter in the basement ceiling, fabric that perfectly matched the shirt Sarah had been wearing when she disappeared. The discovery of potential evidence forced Detective Wells to reconsider the entire timeline and scope of the investigation. The fabric discovery prompted Detective Wells to order the most sophisticated forensic examination the Cedar Ridge Police Department had ever conducted. Using advanced techniques not available during the initial search, investigators found microscopic traces of biological material in the basement that had been missed previously. DNA analysis confirmed Jennifer's desperate hope. Sarah had definitely been in the basement after her official disappearance date. This revelation forced Detective Wells to completely reconsider every aspect of the case. If Sarah had been in the basement, the timeline of her disappearance required complete revision. The detective brought in structural engineers to conduct a thorough examination of the house's foundation and underground spaces, suspecting there might be hidden areas that multiple searches had overlooked. The engineering survey revealed something remarkable that would finally explain the house's century of mysteries. The Millbrook house had been built over a natural cave system that extended beneath the foundation for nearly a mile underground. Access to these caves had been deliberately concealed during the original 1892 construction, with only a small opening hidden behind a false wall in the basement's northwest corner. The opening was so well disguised that it had been missed during multiple professional searches. When investigators finally accessed the concealed cave system, they found clear evidence of recent human presence: a makeshift sleeping area, empty water bottles, food wrappers dating from October 2021, Sarah's missing car keys, and most significantly, a notebook containing her detailed observations about the house's phenomena, written in her distinctive handwriting. The notebook entries revealed that Sarah had discovered the hidden cave entrance on her second day in the house, while investigating sounds coming from the basement walls. Rather than contacting authorities, she had decided to explore the caves herself, driven by her research background and curiosity about the house's mysteries. Sarah's final entry, dated October 17th, described her intention to spend the night underground to determine if the cave system explained the house's reputation for supernatural activity. The notebook ended abruptly mid-sentence. Searchers found no trace of Sarah herself in the accessible portions of the cave system, despite evidence that she had been there for at least 2 days after her disappearance. The caves extended for nearly a mile with multiple passages, some opening to the surface at distant points on the property. The discovery explained the mysterious sightings that had terrorized Cedar Ridge residents. The cave system created natural air currents that caused doors to open and sounds to echo through the house, in ways that could easily be mistaken for supernatural activity. 2 years after Sarah Thompson's disappearance, a heavy spring rain revealed the truth that had eluded investigators for so long. The downpour caused a sinkhole to open in a remote section of the Millbrook property, exposing a previously inaccessible section of the underground cave system. When Detective Wells and her team investigated the newly opened cavity, they found Sarah's remains in a narrow passage that had been blocked by fallen rock. The forensic examination revealed that Sarah had died from injuries sustained in a cave collapse that occurred shortly after her final notebook entry. The underground passage where she was found showed evidence of recent geological instability, with loose rock and shifted limestone formations that had created a deadly trap. Sarah had apparently been exploring a particularly narrow section when falling stones blocked both her path forward and her route back to the basement entrance. The medical examiner determined that Sarah had survived for several hours after the collapse, based on evidence that she had attempted to move rocks and create an opening large enough to escape. Her injuries were consistent with being struck by falling limestone, and the cause of death was determined to be a combination of traumatic injuries and hypothermia in the underground environment. This revelation finally explained the mysterious sightings that had terrorized Cedar Ridge. The cave system's complex acoustics had created the sounds Sarah initially investigated, and air currents moving through underground passages had caused the doors to open and created sensations of movement within the house. The figures witnesses observed were optical illusions created by shadows and light refraction as air moved through the old windows. The Millbrook house's troubled history was partly coincidental and partly the result of the same geological instability that claimed Sarah's life. The cave system had been gradually shifting for over a century, creating environmental changes that made occupants feel uneasy and contributed to the accidents that had occurred throughout the house's history. Catherine Millbrook's 1897 death had been accidental, caused by weakened floorboards over the shifting foundation. Linda Hendrick's 1962 heart attack had been triggered by stress from living above an unstable geological formation that created constant vibrations and unexplained sounds. The house's supernatural reputation was actually the result of very natural, if unusual, environmental factors that had claimed lives for over a century. In the 3 years since Sarah Thompson's remains were discovered, Cedar Ridge has slowly healed from the mystery that consumed it. The Millbrook house stands condemned and empty, a monument to the dangers of pursuing answers that perhaps should remain unasked. Sarah's story has become a cautionary tale about the intersection of curiosity and tragedy, serving as a reminder that not all mysteries are supernatural. Some are simply geological hazards waiting to claim victims. Jennifer Thompson established the Sarah Thompson Memorial Foundation, dedicated to supporting cave safety education and funding research into geological hazards beneath historic properties. The foundation has worked with universities to map underground cave systems throughout Pennsylvania, preventing future tragedies like the one that claimed her sister's life. Detective Wells retired from the Cedar Ridge Police Department 6 months after solving the case, citing the emotional toll of the investigation. She now works as a consultant for missing person cases involving historic properties, bringing her unique experience to help other families find answers. The case became a turning point in her career, teaching her that sometimes the most complex mysteries have surprisingly simple explanations. The case prompted changes in how local authorities handle investigations involving historic properties. New protocols require geological surveys for any missing person case involving buildings constructed over known cave systems or in areas with mining history. These changes have already prevented potential tragedies and improved search efficiency in similar cases. Harold Vickers passed away peacefully 18 months after Sarah's remains were found. His family reported that he had been troubled by the case until its resolution, feeling partially responsible for not investigating further when he first saw the unusual figure. Learning the truth finally allowed him to find peace. Cedar Ridge has grown stronger through this ordeal, with residents developing deeper appreciation for community support during crises. Local organizations now provide better resources for families dealing with missing person cases, ensuring no one faces such trauma alone. Sarah's story serves as a powerful reminder that our desire to understand the unknown can lead us into danger, but also demonstrates the importance of never giving up the search for truth. Her family's persistence in seeking answers ultimately provided closure not only for them, but for an entire community haunted by uncertainty. The Millbrook house remains sealed, but Sarah's legacy lives on through the foundation that bears her name, and the safety measures her death helped inspire. Her story has become part of Cedar Ridge's history, not as a tale of supernatural mystery, but as a testament to human curiosity, family love, and the healing power of finally knowing the truth. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Sarah Thompson's story. We'll see you in the next video.